everybody, and welcome to week 3 of the Self-Made Mastery series. I know up until this point we've been spending a lot of time on numbers, and I do hope that it has been hopefully enlightening for you to be able to see a little bit about where your business is coming from, where your expenses are, and the correlation between the two. That, of course, was what we were doing in week 1. Then we moved to week 2, where we're kind of taking a look at your personal finances. How much does it cost you to run your house on a monthly basis? What are some of the ongoing expenses that are there, whether you can challenge them, you can reduce them, you can eliminate them? As we moved that a little bit further, just outside of just living, right, keeping the lights on and the lifestyle that you currently have, is then asking yourself, what are some of those things of what a life of intention looks like for you? What are some of the trips that you'd like to do? What are some of the experiences that you'd like to have? What are some of the things that you'd like to accomplish, whether it's a certain form of eliminating debt or putting a certain amount of money away? And that's exactly what we're going to be spending a little bit of time on today, taking that lesson just a little bit further and talking about intention for you to define what that looks like for you. So go ahead, get ready. We're going to get started in just a moment. So as a recap of what we've talked about in terms of the fact that the purpose of life is to live a life of intention and the purpose of business is to fund that life, then we have to understand that the sole purpose of business is profit. Now, of course, I can talk about a triple bottom line, right, in terms of profit, people, and planet. We can talk about a lot of those areas, and we definitely will expand a little bit further on what that looks like. But at the end of the day, you are a business owner, you're self-employed, your sole job is to create a level of profitability so that you can fund your life and you can do some of the things that you say you want to do with yourself and your family. Now, this is, of course, where people get a little bit distracted. There are some myths in the myth of more. There's some myths of do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Find the love in the work that you do, and you will never have anything in that way. But in terms of you looking at yourself and your business, you looking at yourself and your life and asking yourself the question of, what is the purpose of this? Why am I spending my time doing the activities that I'm doing? You know, I believe that, quite frankly, a lot of the time, especially with consumerism, that there's this idea that what we do is we jump on the hamster wheel, and we're on the hamster wheel until we die. Now, of course, people have referred to that as a rat race, and there's been other vermin and rodent analogies and metaphors that we can go into, but really the understanding is this concept of a machine life. And if you think of this in terms of the way that we are set up from a societal perspective, is that it's very linear. And what I mean by this is you go to school, and then after you go to school, you're supposed to go to college or some higher learning, maybe a trade or a real estate school or whatever that might be. Then after you finish school, in which all of that was developed so that you could be viable and you could be an asset to the workforce. In addition to that, it's also kind of grooming you culturally so that you can find a spouse, a partner, a significant other, so that you can go through that process of being a part of a relationship. And so this concept of I'm being prepared for work and I'm being prepared for courtship, then I get a job, right? After I get that job, maybe I make some money. I'm looking for a better job. I'm looking for a raise. I'm looking for upward mobility within that space. All the while, I am probably looking for someone that I can share life with. So the idea is that hopefully during this time, I'm getting a better job, in which the whole purpose of the job is to buy stuff, right? Consumable goods and services, and then housing and storage to be able to store that stuff. As I get a raise, my lifestyle raises with it. It's called lifestyle inflation. And so now I buy more stuff and I buy bigger houses, bigger cars, bigger storage to store that stuff. All the while, I'm still courting. Maybe I'm committing to a person or I'm committing to a relationship. And through there, we now are combining two people's stuffs and the house that they are in, right? And then we go through this process of bigger job, more stuff, bigger places to store stuff, right? And we do all of this process over and over and over again. Now, of course, the idea of you purchasing things, you having a home for your family. All of these things are important, but what's most important is that you're asking yourself, what does a life of intention look like for you? When is enough stuff enough? When are you really in alignment with, do I need all of the trinkets? Do I need all of the different kinds of clothes? Do I need these societal status, these social symbols, right? These status symbols. And again, I'm not knocking anybody who has name brand products or drives a luxury vehicle or lives in a desirable community. What I'm saying is making sure that it's what you want and it's not what the multi-billion-dollar marketing industry is telling you that you want, right? And so often this can get in the way in which we get distracted about what's really important to us. And again, I'm not talking about you sitting at home on cardboard boxes with candles, and that's what you're supposed to want. But the idea here is figuring out that if you say that traveling is important to you, but you've not traveled in a few years, non-COVID related, then somehow our activities are no longer in alignment with what we say is important. If we say that we want to be with friends and family, or that we want to be present with our children, but we are working and we're almost never home, well then that would be a portion of where we have some dissonance between what we say we want and what is a reality, right? This is the same concept of doing a dream board, which is, these are all of the things that I say that I want. If I were to win the lottery, yay, that will be the first thing that I purchase. But I'm not going to do anything about my activities to make sure that I'm actively working towards that task or that accomplishment. So when we're talking about a life of intention, it is very, very important that you return to this place. This is where we talk about revisiting goals. And I think it's important to revisit goals. But when you're revisiting the conversation that is, what are the things that are most important to me? And am I asking myself on a monthly, weekly, quarterly basis, what are some of those things that I'm saying that I'm wanting? And is my reality matching those desires? And if the answer is no, then I have to get back into alignment with what that looks like. It's so easy for us to get distracted. It's so easy us to get caught up in the adrenaline of something new, a new relationship, a new job opportunity, a new endeavor, right? 2022 was the year of NFTs. It was a resurgence of crypto. It was the Invest Bros and all of the things that happened with GameStop between 2021 and 2022, right? There's a lot of distractions, which is quite often that get rich quick, right? What can I do to be established immediately? So having these conversations with yourself and being centered with yourself versus being self-centered, right? But being centered with yourself, being centered with the parts of you that you say are important, to make sure that more of your days look in alignment with what you say you want them to look like. That you have more weeks that you feel like this was a great week than a non-great week. That is what we mean by a life of intention. And so taking that a step further and talking about the intention of business, we're going to get into the different stages of wealth and understanding just where you are in this process. It's also allowing you to identify what's important to you. So let's get started. So when discussing wealth, and I know that we talk about wealth often, or the word is used interchangeably quite often, without going through a whole etymology lesson about the word wealth of being an Old English derivative, it's talking about an abundance or surplus. This concept really of and you've heard health, wealth, and happiness, really it was because of this root of the word wealth. This wheel was talking about an abundance. So if I had an abundance of health, I would be in good health. Maybe I am jovial. Maybe I have a sprig of my step, right? These kinds of concepts of being overly healthy or being at a really great place of health was talking about an abundance of health. An abundance of wealth or money, meaning this concept of having more than what was necessary, is really to talk a little bit further about what most people and what most of life look like. You know, I think specifically about our food industry and about agriculture, you know, big farms, big productions, things like Purdue, or, you know, really, quite frankly, anybody whose professional trade of being a farmer. This isn't really a new it is a new concept comparatively as humans. for a very long time, most people took care of their land, took care of their food, took care of whatever their trade was. And if they were able to take care of their family, whatever was left over, that surplus of what was left over, was then what they would barter with other people. This idea of someone being solely a producer of one particular product or one particular service, and then being able to exchange that out to then someone else who focused on one particular product or service. This is a very foreign concept to the history of humans. Now, of course, people were traders, people were rug makers, people were some of these things, but the idea of someone having multiple skills and being able to be self-sustainable to the point of that if they had any extra surplus, then they could provide for other cities or other people. That was very much the basis of how we looked at and accumulated wealth. So wealth as it is currently, in the sense of you typically are providing a good or service, but then you have to pay for all of the other goods and services because of a lack of self-sufficiency or a lack of self-sustainability, again, based on the context of our current economy, is one that causes it to be very difficult, quite frankly, for someone to have a lot of wealth left over. Just as we talked about in week 2, the concept that wealth is determined in the gap between income and expenses is why it's so important that we're able to talk about what your expenses look like for your business, what your personal expenses look like, to get really intentional about understanding where my money is going and is that where I want it to go, right? Just as we spoke in week 2, in the absence of larger goals, in the absence of a larger vision, little things, the shiny object, the new toy, the new distraction seems completely fine and it's absolutely justifiable because there is no exchange. And we've talked about this before in terms of exchanges. So before, right, I would give you, just as talking about that surplus, I would give you maybe some chickens in exchange for a goat, or I might give you some eggs in exchange for you to sharpen some of my cutlery or some of my steel, right? That idea of there was a currency exchange was there. Even then you go fast forward into, say, the last 100 years, right? There used to be, from a consumer perspective, if I wanted a product, I had to give you cash. Again, this is before checks or even before really credit cards. Well, now we've moved to credit cards. And so the concept of the credit card is if I want something, instead of me giving you something in exchange for something else, I just have this card, I pull it out. It never leaves my body, right? I swipe, I put it back in my bag or in my wallet, and then I get the product. Now, there's no longer an exchange. I don't feel like I lose anything because I never had to give you my credit card. I kept it. Well, now you fast forward even closer to today, where we're tapping things, right? Or we're able to do things instantaneously because the material has been saved on our phone, or the credit card information has been saved on our phone or saved on our computer. So the barriers, the resistance of you having money go out is far less than what it has ever been before in history. Again, we are being kind of brought up in this concept of being a perfect consumer, the way that society has built and the way that linear track of things have been. So we must understand the path of money, meaning what happens when you get money. Again, going to that quote of wealth is determined in that gap between income and expenses, is that there are 4 places that your money can go, right? Once you receive your money, you can spend it, you can save it, you can invest it, or you can tithe it or donate it, right? And so this idea of how much do we spend, how much do we save, how much do we invest, and how much do we tithe or donate? Well, that's a very important question. Do you know? Do you have predetermined percentages? We practice spending so much more than any of those other quadrants, right? You use it to buy gas, you use it to buy groceries, you use it on Amazon. It's the holidays, you're using it to buy little things, and every single person that you could possibly think of, all of a sudden you're asking yourself, should I get that person a gift? Yeah, I should get that person a gift, right? Without maybe any kind of budget. So we practice spending almost 100 times more than we practice saving or investing or tithing. So first of all, just kind of giving yourself grace and understanding that if you are a natural spender, right, you save maybe a little bit, but it's far easier for you to spend money than it is for you to save or invest money. Realize that you've been practicing spending for a very, very long time. Give yourself some grace in that, and realize that it's going to require you to be intentional with your money. We can do this exact same example with your time, and we will a little bit later on in this lesson. But understanding those paths. So I can spend money, I can save money, I can invest money, and I can tithe or donate money. Asking yourself, what are those goals? Maybe as you're looking into this next year, you're going to ask yourself, how much would I like to save? Maybe it's a percentage or maybe it's a dollar amount. How much would I like to invest? Again, whether it's a percentage or a dollar amount. Being intentional of understanding what happens as that money comes in is very, very important to you and building wealth. Now, talking about wealth and talking about a life of intention, I am not saying that everybody's goal in life is to be a millionaire or even a multimillionaire. One would expect, and based on the trajectory of things, that in my lifetime, and I think that we're already there, it's very common for someone to have at least $1 million worth of assets. That idea of someone being a millionaire, right, meaning someone who has net assets of $1 million, is not going to be that foreign, right? To be a millionaire is not going to be all that foreign. Being a multimillionaire, figuring out what that cash flow is, I think that is going to be, unfortunately, the next aspect of this conversation. So again, realizing that not everybody's goal is to have millions of dollars or to be a millionaire, right? But understanding that most people want to make sure that they don't have to worry about the roof over their head. They don't want to worry about how they're going to provide food for their family. And then maybe an extension outside of that is, I want to make sure that I'm covered, that my family, my immediate family is covered, and that I can do for others with the excess that I have, right? I would like to believe that at the basic level for each and every one of us, that would be the space that we'd like to be in. We'd like to not worry about our bills. We'd like to make sure that we can do some of the nice things for ourselves and our family, and that we can do some nice things for others. Again, to be good and to do good. Now, how large that is, the scale of that, and the specificity of that is going to be unique to you. But understanding that this concept of having wealth, or this idea that you have in excess of what you need, is then asking you, what do you do with that excess? So that the good that you can do with that excess, right? The idea of, I can't help others if I don't have my own oxygen mask on, is the same concept about our finances. Sex, drugs, and money are things that usually people don't talk about. They definitely don't talk about them at the dinner table. When I was raised, we didn't talk about money. The only time that we talked about money was when we didn't have any, or we needed to pinch a penny. And I like to believe, and I say this quote often, that most often people know how to pinch a penny because they have to. They don't know how to pinch a penny because they want to. And this is where discipline comes in. This is where mindset comes in. This is where having that bigger vision about you and what you want in life comes in. So looking at money mindset is going to be one of the first elements of this topic, right? Where is my mindset about money? Am I a spender? Am I a saver? Am I notoriously kind of in a scarcity mindset of thinking that I'm not going to have money, or that I'm going to lose the opportunity to money? Asking these questions of yourself and having a level of awareness of, what did money look like? So ask yourself, growing up, what were your parents' relationship with money? Was money always there? Was there ever talks about money? Or were the talks always negative? Was it always robbing Peter to pay Paul? Was it one of those of trying to make ends meet, or telling you no in certain areas? And then asking yourself, what was my parents' relationship with money? And then how has that kind of carried over into the way that I look at money today? Now, for some people, maybe they grew up with family that was very frugal, and so then therefore they are very frugal. Or conversely, maybe their parents were very frugal, And so because they felt restricted as a child or growing up, that now they spend frivolously because almost as if they're making up for lost times. Conversely, right, maybe someone grew up where their parents were extremely poor and had to have those sacrifices. And again, they kind of make choices of being frugal because they were raised that way and they never want to go to that place of where their parents were. Or the opposite, where they spend frivolously because, again, they're living the American dream. They're living the life better than their parents, whatever that might look like. So understanding intentionality when it comes to money and using money and business as a vehicle to fund your life of intention is to ask, what does that look like for me? So to kind of share a little bit about myself, I was raised with not very much money. Of course, there were plenty of people who had it far off worse than I did. I think looking back, we had a lot of help in terms of grandparents and people who, gave blessings where they could. But understanding very largely, we were middle class, lower middle class. We were making ends meet in a lot of different ways. I feel like my mother was always struggling with money, making ends meet, making things happen, telling me maybe when I would ask for something, which was just the way a sweet woman says no, but just doesn't want to hurt your feelings. So, very much of growing up in that space, I realize now that even when I have a surplus of money come in, I have a scarcity mindset about money. I have to actively work on remedying that scarcity about where money's going to come from or my ability to generate more money. And so knowing yourself, know thyself, asking what's a certain amount that maybe I have a sleep at night number, right? And I definitely do. And I highly recommend for anybody else that has some of the scarcity mindset, it doesn't really go away. It's that you build things in place to give yourself a little bit more of security. And so that security might look like having a certain amount of money in a savings account or in a checking account, what I call my sleep at night number. And I have to give credit to my coach, Michelle Anderson, who came up with this for me or brought it to my attention. And so for some people, that might be $5,000. It might be $10,000. It might be $50,000. It might be the equivalent of 3 months of expenses or 6 months of expenses. You hear people talk about an emergency fund or the amount that you kind of have as a buffer, a safety net, in case you were to lose a job or whatever it might be. I find that for me, it's not necessarily that large of a number that needs to be cash just sitting there. If I have cash, I want it to be working for me. So there's a small number, though, that I would like to have that basically is there in case of certain emergencies. And a perfect example of this is one of our dogs, Titan. Many of you maybe have already met Titan. Titan is a Great Dane. When he was about 1 year old, we thought that he would, go to the borders and would go to daycare. And he started to have what we felt were signs of kennel cough. And of course, WebMD and everyone believing that they're a doctor or they're a vet in those situations, we saw a lot of symptoms that looked like kennel cough. We brought him to the vet. The vet said, no, it's not kennel cough. You're good. Dismissed us. So we neglected it a little bit more. Ended up that a few days later, I took him on a very long walk. After that walk, he looked dead. And I just thought that maybe he was tired. I walked him a little bit more than normal. But he really was droopy. He was lethargic. He was drooling and snot was coming out of his nose. I know, a little bit too much TMI. We rushed him to the emergency vet. And if you have had any experiences with emergency vets, unlike human healthcare from an emergency perspective, in which they will treat you and figure out payment later, emergency vet care is payment first, figure out treatment after. So they called and said that it was going to cost about $7,000 for him to go into an oxygen chamber and to do some things. It had grown into bronchopneumonia. They had to set him on an IV. Lots of things happened, right? I couldn't imagine how many Americans do not have an additional $7,000 to spend just for their dog's health care. And so that aspect was a big thing for me, which is to understand the emergency component of this, is sleeping at night knowing that in those situations, maybe it's a flat tire or needing to replace tires or needing to pay for something to be able to continue work, there's a certain amount of money that's going to help you feel comfortable and confident about certain things that are happening in your world. So the emergency fund might be an aspect, the sleep at night number. You might have a certain percentage, or you build barriers for yourself. So for me, if I see that money is in an account, I think that that money is available. One of the great things, and it's a wonderful book called Profit First by Mike Kolowitz, is one in which kind of talks about taking the pie and going ahead and cutting it into slices before you serve it, so that you make sure that there's enough for you at the end if you're serving others. Well, the same concept can happen with your money. So having multiple bank accounts set up, maybe a savings account, an operating expense account, a tax account, every time that check comes in, maybe a commission check or something, it's to take that money and automatically slice it up before you ever spend any of it, so that you have things allocated in a certain way. This can be very, very helpful and has been helpful for us to look at. So asking yourself, what are some of those determining factors for you? Maybe what are some things that you have built in that are buffers for yourself for confidence, that you've built in for yourself for a little bit of safety net? Figuring out what's important to you about your finances and looking at some of the just mindset that you have around money. As you continue to look at and explore this idea around your mindset of money, another thing to be mindful of is the fact that usually money, we're all in stages. And those stages are usually debt elimination, wealth accumulation, or wealth preservation. Now, you will never be in one category wholly versus anything else, right? We're probably always going to be kind of like a Venn diagram, transitioning from one to the other, or certain situations might happen that put us back in maybe a debt elimination aspect or in a wealth accumulation aspect. You know, there are some of you that are maybe later in life. Most of the debt that you have is completely paid off. You're still accumulating wealth, but you're also preserving wealth. Maybe you have to start taking some things out of retirement accounts. You're doing certain things or setting things up with wills or trusts. Things that are put into place to be able to be supportive in that space. Maybe you are in the wealth accumulation phase. So you are putting money into savings. You're putting money into retirement accounts. You are buying investment properties, all the while still paying down your mortgage on your personal home, or paying down cars or credit cards, whatever it might be. But understanding that the concept here is that we basically want to get to a place in which most of our debt can be eliminated, or the things that we have debt that has a higher interest rate or that is pulling on compound interest, that we're able to eliminate those things as much as possible so that we can be taking that surplus, right? Again, that gap between income and expenses, so that we can be building our wealth to create future opportunities for ourselves and our family. So one of the exercises, in addition to kind of looking at what your business expenses were in week one, as well as some of those personal expenses that you have on a monthly basis, is to go ahead and identify which of those personal expenses are actually dedicated to liabilities or debt. On a separate piece of paper, go ahead and put down anything that you have that is considered a debt or a liability that's beholden to paying back someone else. If you have a mortgage, if you have maybe a home equity loan or a second mortgage, you have any car payments, if you have maybe a cell phone or an iPad that you are financing monthly through your phone carrier, if you have any credit cards, student loan debts, anything that is a monthly expense right now, that if eliminated, or if you were able to completely pay off, that would no longer be a monthly expectation for your bills. As you're going to go through this process, go ahead and write down what the last known total amount is, whether that's the payoff amount or the amount that is left, as well as the interest percentage that you're paying on each of those debts. So go ahead and hit pause and work on identifying some of those debts and then come back to me in just a moment. So now that you're back with this, one of the things that's fascinating in terms of not only identifying what the debt is, how much the amount is or the liability is, the amount that the liability is left, the interest rate that is there, is also the monthly commitment. So let's say that you have a car payment and the car you owe another $30,000 on, your monthly payment is $500, and the interest rate on that is, 4%. Right? But the understanding is that once that car is paid off, outside of just regular maintenance that might be there, replacing of tires, oil changes, certain things like that, is an understanding that that $500 monthly payment is something that you would no longer have. Same thing as your credit card monthly that you're paying. Same thing with your iPad or your iPhone, maybe with your mortgage payment or that second mortgage payment. What you'll realize is that the amount that it costs you to run your life on a monthly basis actually would be significantly less if some of these debts or liabilities were completely paid off. That's part of the understanding and having to figure out at the root of what it costs you for your personal finances on a monthly basis, as well as figuring out what it's going to be in the future. Part of this idea of understanding financial independence and understanding your own path of wealth is to understand kind of where you are and where it is that you're looking to go. So again, kind of going into those categories of debt elimination, wealth accumulation, and wealth preservation is an understanding of what are some of those things that you are focused on. As we move through this debt elimination process, or minimizing debt as much as possible, which is making sure that you understand how much it costs you to run your life on a monthly basis, also in the future, is something that's very, very important. Part of this concept is an understanding of what are some of those expenses that you have that maybe you wouldn't have if you weren't working or you weren't doing this particular field, right? That is one way of understanding the cost of living. Another aspect of this is to understand what a life by design looks like for you when you are financially independent. And we're going to talk about what financial independence looks like in just a moment. So often people talk about planning for retirement or planning for the future, but not actually understanding how much they want to retire on, how much they want their quality of life to look like at that moment of retirement. And when I talk about retirement or talk about financial independence, let's go ahead and get into what that definition of financial independence and retirement looks like. So the concept of financial independence is an idea that whether you work or not, you are in a place financially in which your way of life, that cost on a monthly basis, would be covered by the assets that you own, the income that you have coming in, the passive income that you have coming in, right? The idea that whether you work or not, that $3,000, $5,000, $15,000 a month, whatever your monthly obligations are, would be covered based on the cash flow that you're receiving from those assets or investments. So financial independence, so often people think about this as retirement, meaning sitting on a beach with pina coladas, never working. That's not the case. Maybe you're someone like me and I'm very passionate about marine biology. Well, quite often, marine biologists aren't making a whole bunch of money, or they're not making enough to be able to fund what my life looks like. We can put it that way. But I might be very passionate and I would love to be able to give 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year of my time working on a project. Well, since one has to be able to support financially, but then also be able to do the things of their passion, is if I get to a place of financial independence, then I'm able to do the activities that I want to do, not the activities that I have to do. So financial freedom or financial independence, this concept of freedom is doing what you want, when you want, with the people that you want, so that you can do what you want to do versus what you have to do. Those obligations of, I have to have so many closings, or I have to have so many transactions to keep the lights on, to pay my mortgage, to pay the house, to pay the car payment, to pay for college, right? All of the obligations that are a part of life is asking yourself, are these things, these liabilities, these obligations, are they in alignment with what I want/need? Do I need 3,600 square feet Does my family and my lifestyle require that many square feet? Or do I have a 3,600 square foot house because I'm trying to keep up with the Joneses, or I'm trying to look a certain kind of way? If I love cars, I'm very passionate about cars, I love luxury cars, and I have a $150,000 vehicle, then fantastic. That's something that's important to me. If cars have no effect on me, I believe that it is to move me from point A to point B, well, then maybe an economy vehicle that's safe, that has a fairly decent kind of buffering for depreciation, maybe like a Toyota Corolla or whatever it might be more in alignment with what my goals are. Maybe instead of carrying a car payment at all, I look to buy something that I can pay for with cash at $15,000 or $20,000, right? This concept of being very intentional about where I'm putting my money, why I'm spending the money that I'm spending, and is it in alignment with what I'm saying is important to me, is quite often something that most people do not do. The average American saves about 2% of their income annually. And again, many people are not this way. More than 70% of Americans would be completely financially insecure based on an emergency of $500 or $700. Just as you and I had kind of spoken about a little bit earlier, that idea of what happened with Titan. Most Americans would not be able to afford the $7,000 for that vet care. They didn't plan for it, they didn't have a buffer for it, or worse, what they do is they're going to have to apply for some kind of credit that is provided by a company that is kind of affecting or taking advantage of people because they know that they cannot afford it, but they have an emotional attachment to their animal. And so they give them credit at an unbelievable high interest rate, knowing that this person's not going to be able to pay it back. And that $7,000 bill that was financed, maybe paid by a minimal payment or a little bit more than a minimal payment, can cost that person $14,000 or even $20,000 because of the effects of compound interest over the life of that loan. So the concept here is understanding that if I'm focused on debt elimination, if I'm focused on building wealth, if I'm focused on establishing a surplus between my income and my expenses so that I can be making conscious decisions about what my life looks like and what my finances look like, I have to have an awareness of what I'm spending, what I'm bringing in, and what I am spending my money on specifically. Again, that pathway of money in general. So looking at this debt that you have, right, or these liabilities, some people don't like that debt word, even though that's what it is. These liabilities that you have, these obligations to other people to repay something that you have, right? We have it outlined. You figured out what are those items. You figured out what the remaining balance is. You figured out what the interest rate is attached to those items. And you figured out what the monthly payments are. Now, there are a couple of schools of thought here. Dave Ramsey, of course, is very famous for shaming people into what is known as the baby steps or the snowball effect, which is this concept of go ahead and find the thing that was on your debt list that has the smallest remaining balance. Maybe there's a credit card that has $2,000 on it, or there's something that has $700 on it. And his concept is to go after those items that are smallest, the 2,000, the 700, whatever it might be, pay them off, and then go after the next smallest. And the snowball effect is that you're eliminating your debt little by little based on that amount of the item that is there. That is one way, and there's definitely nothing wrong with that. I would say if there is anything wrong with it, or maybe to look at it from a different perspective, instead of just looking at the number of the remaining balance, is to actually understand that compound interest truly is the eighth wonder of the world. Compound interest in your favor can be one of the most life-changing and generational wealth-changing tools and vehicles that you can use, period. But when compound interest is used against you, it can be one of the most debilitating things ever. Many people have paid on their college debt for many years and have barely touched the principal, right? They will basically be paying this off for the rest of their life unless they get some kind of inheritance or some large chunk of money somehow that they're able to take a big whack at the principal. So instead of going after the remaining balance, which many people would do, is to go after the highest interest rate. So instead of sorting based on total amount due, is to sort based on interest rate. So let's say someone has a credit card. Typically credit cards, depending on who you are and what they are, they can be anywhere between 18 and 30% as an interest rate. Well, if I have a mortgage at a 5% interest rate and I have a credit card debt at 25%, realizing that that interest of what I'm paying as a percentage, right? Meaning for every dollar that I spend using that credit card, it's going to cost me $1.25 to be able to do that. Or I'm going to add a 25% sticker price on top of what I already see. I'm going to make sure that I'm eliminating that credit card debt before I'm really worried about tackling paying more on the mortgage than is that 5% interest rate. If you have college debt, again, maybe that interest rate was at 7.5% or 8%. If you cannot refinance your college debt, hopefully you could be able to get it smaller, then that would be one that would be higher up than my mortgage, right, in terms of the percentage, but it would be less than the 25% for my credit card. So this concept of going after these things based on the interest that you're paying someone else versus the interest that something could be paying you could be one of the main things that you're doing to focus on debt elimination. Well, why does it matter? You think if my car is paid off and I'm no longer having to worry about $500 a month for that, if my credit card is paid off and I was doing a minimum payment of $300 a month, that's $800 of my monthly expenses that I no longer have to worry about. As I take this and I get very aggressive, I might find that $4,000 or $5,000 of my monthly expenses, my monthly obligations, were because of these liabilities, because of these debts. Well, I don't know about you, but just eliminating $3,000 or $4,000 on a monthly basis is going to allow me to feel a little bit better. It's going to allow me to not have to come up with what that $3,000 or $4,000 looks like every single month, whether I have it or not. If I am hedging against a recession, I might be looking ahead and seeing what are some of those opportunities that are there, as well as being able to be very intentional about some of the things that are, what do I do with that money? Maybe I still make the same amount of money that I've made before, but instead of $3,000 or $4,000 that are going towards obligations, I'm able to take that $3,000 and $4,000 and invest it in investment properties, or put it into a savings account, or put it into my retirement, doing things to move myself closer to this aspect of wealth accumulation. Now that you've taken some time to look at some of the debt that you carry, some of those liabilities, and figuring out whether you need to eliminate them, reduce them, potentially refinance them, the next aspect of this is to understand wealth accumulation. So that wealth accumulation, again, that gap between income and expenses, is the vehicle that you use to be able to purchase things, to invest in new properties, to be able to do things both for yourself currently as well as the future. This again goes back to that concept of financial independence or financial freedom and what that looks like for you and your family. Wealth accumulation can be done in a multitude of ways. Usually when we talk about the flow of money, this would be where we would be spending, or not rather spending, but saving or investing. So if the purpose of your kind of goals are to save money, maybe you're saving up for a purchase, so that you do not have to finance or that you don't need to do it on debt, then that would be one area. Maybe you are looking to put money into a retirement account or into the stock market, or you're looking to purchase a particular property. Again, these would be goals that you've set for yourself from an investment perspective. So how do you find out what the number would be for financial independence? Well, there was a study that was done that's called the Trinity Study. It was actually done by a few economists from Trinity College in Texas, in which they asked the question that is more often asked by many people who are going through the process of retiring. And one of the biggest fears of retirees is that they're going to have more life than bank account. And the idea of being at the very end of their life and having to either be dependent upon the government or dependent upon family members can be a very scary and lack of dependence for many people. So In the Trinity study, what they discovered is they first wanted to test what were the scenarios that would ensure that someone would have enough money through retirement. And they looked at retirement as being about 30 years of retirement. So, thinking about if someone was 60, then they were running these numbers based on a 90 or would be 90 years old, a 30-year spread. For many people, right, in terms of the way that things were done for a very long time, was that retirement age was 65. And the average age for Americans for most of the 20th century was to look at, and that was around 73 to 75. So even though people were curious about a 30-year time span, most people didn't actually make it. They made it 10 to 11 years before they had died from retirement to death. And I bring this up not to be morbid, but I bring this up as a point of saying there is an element of planning for the future while also enjoying the present. I know that many of you, if you've been around for a while, you know that I talk about, I've had uncles, actually two of my uncles, both of which were middle-aged, they were both in their 50s, had died unexpectedly in their 50s. They never made it to retirement. One passed in the middle of the night of a heart attack, and he was someone who was very religious. He was very close to being retired. He worked very religiously, was a loyal employee. They had 3 weeks off a year for vacation. They would spend 2 weeks on the Jersey Shore. They had a place there, and they would spend a week down in Florida visiting myself and my family, and was working and plugging away to plan for retirement, and he never made it. Another uncle of mine had been dealing with some issues, had back surgery, and had some things going on with his foot. They thought that there were complications to potentially gout. And one evening he was at dinner with my aunt, was talking about the restaurant, saying that his mother would love this place. My aunt made a comment of, "Yeah, I know, we brought her here." And he said, "No, I've not seen my mother in 3 years." And they had seen her just a few months earlier. She took him to the hospital. That was Friday. He was diagnosed with leukemia, and he was brain dead by Sunday. So I share these, again, not to be morbid, but there is obviously an element for all of us that is, do I deprive my present, the joy and things that are going on now, my lifestyle now, to pinch pennies and to not enjoy life, to plan for a retirement or a future that I might not ever make it to? And I understand this. Truly, I do. It's something that Doug and I talk about all the time. And then there's the other, what happens if you live a long and healthy life and you want to be around for family or for experiences and other things, but you were living really by the moment during those wealth accumulation years, during the best years of your life of being able to generate wealth for yourself and your family. And now you find yourself in a position to where you do not have the ability, maybe the workforce is no longer advantageous for you, you do not have the ability to make the type of income that's necessary. And so your quality of life for the last half, or the last third of your life, is less than what you want. Well, we plan for both, and we're conscious about both, and we're very intentional about both in terms of what we're doing. So in terms of looking at financial independence, this idea of how much do I need to have in assets to be able to be financially independent, the Trinity study found, again, through this process, that it's what is known as the 4% rule. And the idea here is that they found through a mixture of 100% bonds and 100% stocks to 50-50, 75-25, they looked at all the different variables, that roughly there is about a 7% or 8% is the average return on investment. So thinking about this for a moment with stocks, is if I invest in the S&P 500 and I continue to invest in that it's going to garner roughly about a 7% annual return on investment. Now, of course, if you've been in stocks this year, it has not been that return. If you were in stocks a few years ago, it was almost 4 times that return in any given year. So this is an average over the course of your multiple years, multiple decades of investing, that there will be an average return of about 7%. Taking that into consideration, they also took into consideration the average rate of inflation. So the average rate of inflation is roughly about 3%. You think about the cost of milk. What is the cost of milk today versus what it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago? You look at the cost of gas. I think most of us can recognize in the cost of gas and fuel where that has risen over the course of the last 5 or 10 years. You see it in terms of college expenses and tuition going up, or rent going up year after year. The basic price of a vehicle is going up year after year. And so one of the biggest elements of this is to realize that the average rate of inflation is roughly about 3%. And so taking that 7% to that average rate of return and planning for that 3% of inflation year over year, the gap in between 7 and 3 is 4. And that 4% is the rule. So the idea is that if you can live on 4% of the withdrawing 4% from your net asset, then you would never actually touch the nest egg. You would be able to live on that effectively. And that actually by the time that you died, there was a 98% chance that by the time that you died, there would still be money left over. In more than half of the chances, what it had found was that people had never even touched their nest egg, that by the time that they retired, or by the time that they died rather, that the nest egg had grown in size instead of depleted because they were able to live on that 4%. Now, this is specific to stocks. And I know that this happens quite often with stocks of people who are looking at just the stock market. But if we talk about the stock market, and maybe that's not for you, maybe you are looking to invest in real estate. The same thing could be talked about in terms of buying and holding doors or long-term rentals. Is that typically for people who have rental income, the idea of there being about a 7% return on investment every single year on your rentals is where this number also can be applicable. Again, the 3% of inflation and that 4% rule of living off of. So we can take both of these ideas and figuring out, well, how much do I need to be financially independent? The reason why we spent so much time in week 2 talking about your personal monthly finances, and the reason why you were starting to identify those things that are debts or liabilities for you and what that monthly looks like, is that we can then start to figure out that what would I need to make on an annual basis if I had very little debt or as minimal debt as possible, and I was still living a level of quality of life, a life of intention that included the trips, it included where I wanted to put my money or invest my money, the things that I'd like to do with the people that I'd like to do it with. I take all of that into consideration and I find that number. Now let's say that for simple math, I say that I want to live on $100,000 a year. Now, for some of you, $100,000 might sound like a lot. And for others, $100,000 doesn't seem to cut it at all. It doesn't matter. Again, this is just a placeholder to be able to work through this mathematical equation together. But the idea is also to take in consideration, that is, maybe $100,000 seems small compared to what my current annual responsibilities or necessities are. But assuming that I have a few years left before I would be retired, that the idea that by the time that I am looking to retire, my mortgage would be completely paid off. I would have a good, reliable vehicle that doesn't have any kind of car payment on it. I would have most of my debts paid off. And so I find that my cost of living, comparatively what it was before when I had a mortgage and a car payment and credit cards and some of the other things that are going on, including the mortgages on investment properties that hopefully by the time that I am looking to retire, I have renters that have paid that off completely for me, that the cost that it requires to maintain my lifestyle is actually less by that point of retirement than what it is currently. So let's say again that by that moment of retiring and I have eliminated much of my debt, I find that I would like to live on $100,000 per year. Well, the 4% rule can actually be inverted. So you would take the number that you need on an annual basis and you would times it by 25, right? And that's how we would find that 4%. So if I said 100,000 and I times that by 25, then that means that I need roughly about $2.5 million of assets in terms of the stock market that is yielding a 7% average return. And I'm planning for the 3% inflation for me to get that $100,000 of a 4% withdrawal would be the $100,000 is 4% of 2.5 million. I'd like you to do the same exercise for yourself. So go ahead and pause here. What you're going to do is you're going to ask yourself, what is the annual amount of money that I would need to be able to be financially independent? Whatever that annual number is, I want you to then times that number by 25, and that's going to get you your financial independence number. Go ahead and do that exercise now. Okay, now that we're back and you've run through those numbers, some of you might be freaking out, thinking that the number is very high. Some of you are looking at it and going, wow, I'm actually not too far off than where I needed to be. This is the fun aspect of wealth accumulation. So instead of just saving or depriving for the sake of doing so, you actually have a goal of financial independence. You know what kind of lifestyle you would be having at that point, and you are working actively towards building a plan to get it done, right? Unlike the dream board where I cut things out of a magazine and I stick them to a poster board and dream that one day I'll hit the lottery to hit those things, I instead am building a plan of things that I can do on an annual basis to make sure that I get there. So let's keep with the same example of I want to live on $100,000 a year, which means I need about $2.5 million worth of assets. Well, I can either do that through the stock market, or I can also do that through real estate. And so that might look like 10 houses that are worth $250,000 that are yielding a certain kind of rent and cash flow, that by having those 10 properties and those rents on all of those, again, by the time that I financially am looking for independence, would need to yield about $8,000 worth of income each month. Well, that could be 10 $250,000 houses. That could be five $500,000 houses. And so imagine that, let's say that you were looking to retire or be financially independent in 10 years from now. And we just figured out that your number was 2.5 million and that you would need about $100,000 per year to live off of. Well, now the goal could be that for each year for the next 10 years, you want to be able to buy an investment property. An investment property at $250,000 as a sales price, let's just say, and you want to put 20% down. So you would need to make sure that with your life of intention, that part of that is saving the $50,000 each year that you would need to put as the down payment on a $250,000 property. Then the next year, $50,000 for that $250,000 property. And you did this for 10 years, that by the time that you hit 10 years from now, you would have 10 $250,000 properties. And we can actually get into the specifics of where you would use the rental income to pay down the mortgages on those properties. So by the time that you made it to year 10, based on these numbers in quick math, about 3 or 4 of those properties would be already completely paid off in full with their mortgage, and you're working towards paying off the last 6. So that by the time that you retire, and then by the time that you leave your assets to your children or your grandchildren or to the ASPCA or the Florida Orchestra, whatever it might be, that you found that they've been completely paid off and you're building generational wealth for you and your family. See, there's so much that can be excited about this, and I don't want to go too much down a rabbit hole here because this really isn't one where we're going to talk so much about finances. I know we already have spent quite a bit of time, but this is how we can get excited about wealth accumulation. This is where we can be focused on what are we doing to set ourselves up, our futures up, and that it also makes life a little bit easier for ourselves. You know, if I have consistent income that's coming in through those properties, or through the stock market, but I don't need any of that money because I'm already making my money through my businesses, then I'm using that income to pay down those debts, right? So the concept of I have house number 1 at $250,000, and then year 2, I buy house number 2 at $250,000. Well, what I want to do is I want to take 100% of the rental income on property number 1, and I want to pay down the mortgage of property number 1. Now with property number 2, I'm going to pay property number 2's mortgage, and then if there's anything left over, let's say it's $300 of cash flow each month from property number 2. Instead of me taking that $300 and putting it into my pocket to pay for groceries or whatever it might be, of which I don't really need it because I'm already making my money from my businesses, I take that $300 cash flow from property number 2 and I'm attacking the principal of the mortgage of property number 1. All the while, in year 3, I buy property number 3. Property number 3 cash flows $300. I'm taking that cash flow and I'm attacking the mortgage on property number 1. So now property number 1's completely paid off. And so we're taking the revenue of property number 1 and we're attacking the interest in the mortgage of property number 2. We're taking the cash flow of property number 2 and we're attacking the mortgage of property number 2. We're taking the cash flow of property number 3 and we're attacking the mortgage of property number 2. We bought property number 4, we're doing the same process. And so as each one gets paid off, we have the full amount of rental income from property number 1 attacking property number 2. Now property number 2 is paid off. We take the full rent from property number 1 and property number 2, and we're attacking property number 3. I know that this sounds crazy, but this idea, as we talked about earlier in this session, of compound interest truly being the eighth wonder of the world, that in 10 years' time, you could be in a position to where you have multiple assets that are completely mortgage-free, debt-free, that are giving you cash flow, and that are building your wealth and setting you up. All the while, you are still living on the amount of money that you are making through your businesses, right? So often people are utilizing vehicles of investments, and then they're using that to buy products or services or depreciating assets. They're using their wealth to buy liabilities instead of using their wealth to buy assets. This is again going into the money mindset of what am I doing to eliminate debt, to build wealth, and then to preserve that wealth. As a society, we get focused on the liabilities. Many companies spend billions of dollars marketing liabilities. Status symbols are seen in the liabilities. People gauge your value on those liabilities. But I would love for us to change our mindset as a collective group. If there was nothing else in the people that are here, it's, I don't want you to look rich. I want you to be rich. And what I mean by rich is I want you to have an abundance. I want you to be able to provide for yourself and your family. And I want with the excess that you can do what you want with that. You can help your neighbor. You can help a local organization. You can make a difference in other people's lives, whatever that looks like for you. The idea of getting really intentional about wealth accumulation is understanding the power of what you can do for your life and the lives of those around you. So we've talked on debt elimination and wealth accumulation. There will be a stage closer to a retirement in which we're focused on wealth preservation. Now, this is in the form also of setting up wills and trusts for the people that are in your family, establishing or putting some of your products and your assets into shielding organizations, right, like an LLC or other things that are protecting them and your family from liabilities or lawsuits, right? That would be like an LLC, a limited liability company. Looking at some of those things that you can do to help yourself. Now, I want to preface, I am not a CPA, I'm not a financial planner, I'm not a tax accountant, I'm not an attorney. So please seek guidance from those specialists in those areas. But the concept here of preserving your wealth is by making sure that you have them set up as advantageous as possible for taxes and for protection. Many of you that live in Florida, and I know that this applies all across the country, but Florida is the lawsuit capital of the world. They are the home of the 1-800-ASK-GARY, and they have made a profession of ambulance chasing. There's nothing wrong with that form of business. We know many lawyers and people in our world that have made a great living in this, and there absolutely are companies that should be paying their fair share, talking about insurance companies. But with that being said, you don't need to be sued just because of being sued, and you don't need things that you've worked hard for or that your family has worked hard for being subject to those same costs. So please make sure that through wealth accumulation and wealth preservation that you're setting things in motion. Making sure that you are doing what you can to help with your own health, right? So when we talk about wealth of health, wealth, and happiness, making sure that you're doing things to make sure you live a long and healthy life, making sure you have adequate life and health insurance to be able to protect yourself and your family. We've got a lot of these tools that you can use in your packets of information that I want you to be able to focus on, but understanding that the whole purpose of business is to fund your life of intention, not deprive you of it, and not to replace what a life of intention looks like. Building and accumulating that wealth is to be able to enjoy the fruits of your labor. And then the wealth preservation aspect, much like making jams and jellies and jarring certain things before they go bad, is the same thing of making sure that the wealth that you build for yourself doesn't necessarily die with you, that it is something that it can make generational changes for your family, it can make an impact on the organizations that you care very deeply about, that it's able to make an impact, and that you have a legacy after you are no longer here. So I know that week 2 was titled Funding a Life of Intention, and this is kind of a two-part. This is part 2 of week 2, but the aspect of living with intention has a lot to do with what we do with our money. Again, the flow of money, of where you spend it, where you save it, where you invest it, and where you tithe it, has a lot to do with your life of intention. The legacy that you want to leave. For those of you that in week 2 did your obituary, you talked about some of the organizations or the people that you had an influence on. And there's no difference to do when talking about the funding and the things that you can do, the lives that you can change through what you do with money. Money is often seen as a currency exchange. But we talk about money and we talk about currency, but we sometimes don't necessarily talk about the fact that money is energy. And energy, when talking about life energy, is an exchange of life energy. So typically I will do work. So I am exchanging my life energy for the money that I am compensated for the work that I do. And then conversely, I am paying money to someone else in exchange for their life energy, right? For the server that serves me at dinner, who is running back and forth from the kitchen and putting in my order and making my drinks and all of that, I then am going to pay them a gratuity because I am paying them for their life energy. They just dedicated an hour of their life to me. I am going to pay them in exchange for that. So often we think about how much we're going to pay for a bag or a mug or a trip or a vacation from the idea of, well, how much is this going to cost me? But very few times do we actually look at what is the cost associated with your life energy. So one, we first have to put a value to what your life energy looks like. And two, this is where I think was one of the most transformational thoughts for myself on my life energy and what I'm giving my energy to. So an example of this is back when I was working for corporate and was supposed to be there from about 8 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I would come home and would be home. During that time, we have to eat dinner, we kind of reset, we maybe do some things, and then I had a goal for myself that I would be in bed by 9 p.m. reading so that lights could be out by 10, so that I could be up by 5 and I can do my whole routine in the morning before being at the office at 8. What that meant was that after leaving work at 5, getting home at, let's say, 5:30 or 6 o'clock, I basically had from 6 p.m. until 9 p.m. to spend with my family. Well, if during that time, Doug is maybe working on dinner and I am ironing my clothes and his clothes for the next day, in which I do that in a different room, then about one of those hours, or roughly about 40 minutes, the time that it takes for him to make dinner and the time it takes for me to iron, we were spending apart, which meant that I took the 3 hours that I have with my family and I've now chopped it down to 2 hours, or 2 hours and 20 minutes. What ended up happening is that even though I had found ironing therapeutic, I know I might be a little weird, there was a Zen aspect of base brain and just being able to do activity. There was satisfaction of ironing out the wrinkles, right? Same thing that happens for me with vacuuming. I had to take into consideration the amount of time that it took away from my family. So when we look at life energy, some of the things that we can ask ourselves is, what am I doing in exchange for my time? So those 40 minutes of my life, I had to ask myself, well, how much would it cost to dry clean 2 shirts and 2 pairs of slacks, right? Clothes for him and clothes for me. And let's just say that that equated to $12 in total or $15 in total. So I was exchanging the 40 minutes of time that I could have with my partner in exchange for something that could have been completed with $12 or $15 at the dry cleaner. I had to ask myself, was it worth me not paying or me saving the $12 or $15 to not have that time with my partner? Or would I rather spend the $15 to be able to spend that time with him? And that is obviously one of those choices. The other aspect of this is also what can happen when we look at our work activities. So if you work 40 hours a week, and let's say that you work for 50 weeks in a year, that's 2 weeks of vacation, which for some of you, that sounds like not enough time at all. And for others, you wish you could find 2 hours or 2 weeks in a year to take off. I'm also doing it for simple math. Let's say that you work 40 hours a week for 50 weeks. That equals 2,000 hours. So you look at how much you made last year, or you might look at this year based on your week 1 and week 2 results. You'll find, let's say that again, you made $100,000 this year for simple math. You would then divide that $100,000 by 2,000 hours, and you would find that you make roughly about $50 an hour. Now, the reason why this is enlightening is because you can see that sometimes you all like to make flyers, or you like to make social media posts, or you like to do certain tasks that if you were to pay someone else to do, it might look like a $15 an hour job, or an $18 an hour job, or a $20 an hour job. Now what you have to ask yourself is, because I am not willing to pay someone $20 an hour, I am also causing myself to not do those things that cause me to make $50 an hour. Now, if I was to increase those activities, focus on client acquisition, meeting with clients, meeting new people, that I might actually be able to increase the amount of money that I make per hour through my effectiveness by outsourcing to someone else. This is where we get caught up in the what are the highest and best uses of your activity. So living with intention is to say, I'm going to work to be able to support my family, and then as soon as I have achieved that, I need to be able to turn it off to go live the life of intention. This is where people get caught in the hamster wheel. They get so caught up in work, or more, and the myth of more, that they forgot that the purpose of business was to fund their life of intention, and instead work becomes their life, right? Now, if that is the path for you, you want to be a workaholic, you want to do those activities, and I know we talked about this in week 2, right? The gentleman who says, I'm working all the time to be able to support my family, to provide a better life for my family, to do all of these things for my family, but they're never home. They're constantly working. When they are at home, they're on their computer, or their family sees the top of their head. They're not really building any deep relationships with their family. There wasn't really a difference between making $300,000 and $400,000 in terms of the quality of life that they had for their family. So they're telling themselves a story that they are doing all of this work to provide a better life for their family, when actually they're doing it for themselves. They're completely dismissing that either A, there's an adrenaline and a dopamine that happens to closing the big hunts, or catching the big fish, closing the big deals. They are completely dismissing the self-worth that is now tied into their success, right? The person who has to be number 1 for the month in sales, the person who has to have more transactions than anybody else, the person who needs to be on all of the panels talking about some of those things. There's nothing wrong with that. But also having to take into consideration that, am I working because I want to work? Am I working because I like the way that it makes me feel? Am I working because my self-worth is tied up in my work? And that being needed by my clients is something that I have wrapped up in, that I keep telling myself that I'm doing this for my family and I'm doing this to provide a better life, but I'm not acknowledging the aspect that I'm doing it for myself and my own satisfaction, right? This is not a place for shame. It's not a place for guilt. It's a place of going, if that is important to you, then making sure that you're not making your family feel like a burden, that you're doing this for them, as opposed to telling them it's providing a great life for family and you're doing it for you, that it's fulfillment for you, and that it helps you do whatever it is that you want to do. It makes you feel good about yourself. See, there's a big difference between making your family feel like they are the reason why you're never home, and they are the reason why you are so stressed out and why you are self-medicating and some of the other things, versus acknowledging that it's a portion of it, but that you're also doing it for you. So taking some time for yourself, this is why when we talk about that North Star and revisiting what a life of intention looks like, that you don't get caught up in the hustle and bustle, that you don't get caught up in the shiny objects or some of the other things, that you are really understanding why you're working. What is the value for you? What is the purpose? What is it that you're trying to fund, the experiences you're trying to do, the life that you're trying to have, the lifestyle you're trying to maintain? Hold on to that and revisit often, but make sure that you don't lose yourself in the process, that you lose the things that brought you joy. You lose the hobbies or the special relationships that you have, that you are being 100% real with yourself, and that you're being centered and grounded in the motivations that bring you to work and the things that are there. You know, when we talk about burnout, or we talk about losing motivation, or I'm just not passionate about it anymore, it's usually because we've moved too far away from aligning our day-to-day activities with the real reason why we're doing what we're doing. We get caught up in the whirlwind of everything that we forgot why we do what we do and what it is that we're funding. So if you haven't already done so, you can use this as an opportunity to press pause and ask yourself those questions. Why do I work? What is the fulfillment that I get from the work that I do? What is the purpose of my work? What am I funding with the work that I do? And what is happening with my money, with the path of money? How much am I spending? How much am I saving? How much am I investing? And how much am I tithing or donating? Go ahead and answer these questions, and then when you're ready, we'll continue. One of the biggest elements of this process and really understanding a life of intention is to be purposeful in your days and being mindful in your ways. And one of the ways that we do this is through time blocking and time management. You know, a lot of people, especially those that identify as being creatives, really find that something like time blocking can be restrictive or restricting. Yet it's so fascinating that I look at some of the greatest artists in their space. Think of Picasso or Salvador Dali, or some of the great writers like Ernest Hemingway or Stephen King. These individuals that if you look at their schedules, they were very religious about having a daily routine. More often it happened, Picasso sketched every single day, right? Ernest Hemingway wrote every single day, starting early in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, every single day. Stephen King talks about when he works on a project or he's working on a book, he writes every single morning and has a schedule that is a mix of being very intentional before about lunchtime and then what his afternoon looks like. The idea of time blocking or time management is for the same reason why we build a budget for our money, we build a budget for our time. And that's what time blocking allows us to do. It allows us to make sure that we are spending it in those places. We're kind of pre-slicing the pie to make sure that we are not focused on one particular area and lacking somewhere else. Many of you, myself included, have an air of being somewhat obsessive. You can go down a rabbit hole and spend 15 hours on something, and then realizing that in the process of doing that, you've neglected many of the other things that are there in your life. Time blocking allows you to be able to be intentional for certain periods of the day or certain periods of the week, making sure that you are accumulating a certain aspect of each day that is focused on learning, that's focused on working, and that's focused on play, right? Again, making sure that we know what we're funding and making sure that we're living a life of intention. So one of the things that comes up when looking at your daily calendar is, what should my day look like? Where should my interest be? What are some of those activities that I should make sure are there either every day or at least on a weekly basis? Looking at an ideal week, I would love for you to take in, maybe you do this with Google Calendar or you have a daily planner. We have some opportunities within your packet that talks about weekly goals, daily goals, or even annual goals. But what I'm talking about is maybe taking the Google Calendar on your computer, going ahead and kind of wiping it completely clean and looking at it from a weekly glance. From the weekly glance, you will then start to put things on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, right? Looking at some of the things that are there for you. If working out and going to the gym is something of value for you, make sure that it's on the calendar. If date night with your partner, your spouse, partner, significant other is important to you, put it on the calendar. In addition to that, what are some of the things that I can do in my day to make sure that I'm focused both on new business as well as servicing other business? The way that I like to look at this is I clock in and out and I work 2 jobs. Job number 1 is client acquisition, and job number 2 is the business that I am in. So the idea here is it's also understanding that your morning is the cause and your afternoon is the effect. So in my world, typically I like to block about 7:30 in the morning until noon. And that is my time that is focused on client acquisition, client retention. It allows me to do the things that are necessary to be in front of people in generating future and new business. The afternoon becomes a reaction. It becomes the effect of those things that I do in the morning. So if you're a real estate agent, I can use you as an example. Maybe you're getting into the office at 7:30, or you're getting to your desk at 7:30. You're looking at your emails, you're reviewing your calendar, you're doing some of the things of making sure that you're not already putting out fires, but you're being aware of what there is for the day to do. From there, maybe you are getting prepared on what you're going to say and who you're going to call or who you're going to message, who you're going to reach out to. Then in the morning, maybe from 9 until 11, you're focused on actual client acquisition, making those phone calls, sending Facebook messages, writing thank you cards, getting your postcards ready and generated and proofed so that they can go out. The things that are getting you in front of potentially new customers. Then from 11 to 12 is any kind of follow-up. Who did I say I needed to follow back with? Who did I need to email? Who did I ask for a consultation, but they never got back to me, so I need to circle back with them and get something on the calendar. Using that time also as an opportunity to go into my database, add notes from the conversations that I've had, set new reminders for follow-up in the future, whatever that might look like. And then at noon, I am eating lunch. I'm stepping away from the computer, I'm stepping away from my office, I'm getting some fresh air, taking the dogs out, grabbing a bite to eat, and then realizing that my afternoon is going to be a reaction to that morning. Well, if I have business, well then my afternoon I'm going and I'm showing homes. My afternoon I'm going on listing appointments. My afternoon I am going to home inspections or appraisals. I'm scheduling my closings in the afternoon so that I can be present in the afternoon. But what so often happens with many people, and this isn't just real estate agents, is that they focus on generating business, then they get business, and they service that business, then the business is done, they look around and they don't have anything for future business, and they do this vicious cycle over and over again. So many of you left an employee role where you were living paycheck to paycheck, going into business for yourself and going to change it, and all you did was just move from paycheck to paycheck to commission to commission. And anybody knows that if you live like that, it can cause you to have unpredictability about future money, unpredictability about where you save money or invest money, right? Why would I go ahead and get rid of that money to where I don't have access to it in the future if I don't know what the future looks like? So much of this, and this is what we're going to focus on next week in terms of planting seeds, and really what are those activities that you're doing to generate business and consistent business, is to go ahead and look at your calendar and say, what are the activities that have the most impact on my success, my happiness, and the future of my business? Well, what has the biggest effect on my success and my happiness? For me, that would be a good night's sleep and making sure that I'm pouring good, positive information into my body. Well, a good night's sleep is set up the day before. So actually, me doing time blocking for tomorrow begins today. It begins with what I do this evening. Making sure I get up early and enough time and that I have my clothes already picked out, that I have the coffee already set for the morning. I'm setting my morning up for success the day before. In addition to that, right, if I know that a good night's sleep is a portion of that, making sure that I'm removing the hurdles, because I can get frustrated very, very quickly, is removing some of those hurdles the day before so that I don't have those hurdles in the morning. My coffee is already ready, it's already timed, and so that when I wake up, it's ready to go. My clothes are already picked out. They've either been dry cleaned or they've been ironed. I know exactly what I'm going to be wearing for tomorrow, so I don't have to worry about, do I have anything clean or ready to go? My calendar is kind of set, so I know who I'm talking to and what I need to talk about. That's all been prepared the night before. In the morning, I'm either reading or I'm watching a YouTube video or I'm doing a guided meditation. I'm putting good, positive information into my world. I used to start by having push notifications on my phone and reading emails, right? Well, for some of you, you might read an email and you see that there's a fire. Something blew up overnight and you feel like you have to address it at the very beginning of the day. That's already pulling you away from client acquisition. That's job number 2. You still have to clock in to job number 1 at 7:30 in the morning and clock out at noon to clock in to job number 2, which is putting out those fires in the afternoon. I know that this is difficult. I know that for some of you, this is a reprogramming in a lot of ways, but understanding that there are no emergencies in most of your businesses. Those of you that I coach or that I work with, no one dies if you don't get to them within 20 minutes in your field of work. So realizing that setting boundaries for yourself are one of the most important things that you can do for yourself and your success. What it's doing is it's allowing you to have balance. It's allowing you to have intention. It's allowing you to work with the right people that are in alignment with who you are and what you want. See, if my day begins with intention, and then I move through the activities with intention, and I'm being impeccable with my now, then what I'm able to do is I'm able to move through the day feeling like I actively was intentional with the progress that was made. I know whatever I didn't get to, I can add to tomorrow's activities. I can be purposeful in the tasks that take some of my attention. And I'm also making sure that I'm not getting distracted too often. I allow myself some freedom. I allow myself some improvisation. I allow myself to be lazy sometimes, but I'm still asking myself the questions such as, what is one thing that I can do today that's going to move my business forward with the least resistance? You know, there's a quote from Gary Keller and Jay Papasan in their book, The One Thing, that says, what is the one thing such that by doing makes everything else easier or unnecessary? That's the idea of working smarter, not harder. And so asking yourself that question, what's the one thing for lead generation today or client acquisition today that I could do that makes everything else easier or irrelevant? I can ask that same question for if maybe part of my goals, and we're going to get into the 7 circles here in a moment. But let's say that for my key relationships, right, with my husband, what is the one thing such that by doing it makes everything else easier or unnecessary with my relationship with my partner? Well, that could be having one-on-one conversation. That could be checking in and spending quality time with them every single day. That could be making sure that we have date nights once a week so that we're not just moving through the motions of, did you pick up the dry cleaning? Did you go to the grocery store? Is this taken care of? Is that taken care of? You know, is the dog food, where are we at with dog food, right? All of a sudden that feels like roommates, or that feels like we are working towards a business together versus ever checking in with our relationship. That was something that happened in our world. We were working together with a real estate business that we both still own. And it felt like we were checking in as manager and employee versus spouse and partner. So thinking about these things and looking at those activities, this idea of being intentional, I know, can also have a feeling or the perception of being a lot. Like, man, that's a lot of thought. That's decision fatigue. You're making the decision whether you make a decision or not, right? The lack of decision is a decision. So if I can be purposeful in the areas of my life that bring me joy, that bring me strength, that bring me support, realizing that if I can do one thing such that by doing makes everything else easier and necessary, I'm going to do the work. It's just a matter of if I'm going to do the work on the front end or I'm going to do the work on the back end. So talking about this in your workbook, there is the 7 circles. These are the areas of your life that typically we put our energy, we put our time, that we can have a positive effect on. So often what we look at, these 7 circles are going to be spiritual. So if you're looking at the workbook, you have the 7 circles around. You would start at the one that it's at 12 o'clock, and we would say that that's spiritual. The one next to it, if you're going clockwise, that would be 1 o'clock. You're going to look at, that would be your physical health. After that, we look at your personal health. We'll talk about that. From there, we're talking about key relationships. This would be your spouse, partner, significant other. Maybe this is looking like your mother or your children, right? That would be your key relationships. From there, we then move into your job. Outside of your job, we move to your career. We'll talk about how those two are different. From career, then we talk about your finances. And then lastly, for a bonus, we would talk about recreational, or the things that you do to pour into your own cup. And so the idea here is that you can go ahead and kind of gauge yourself, and you can do this on your reflective resource, and just ask yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being that you're exactly where you want to be. You would look at your business and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being absolutely where I want to be, what would I rate myself spiritually? For my physical health, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being I'm knocking it completely out of the park, what would I rate my physical health in terms of the food that I'm eating, the sleep that I'm getting, the working out, feeling good about my body, and my health in general? For my personal health or personal growth, what am I doing to pour into my own cup? What am I doing to grow and be a better version of myself, whatever that might look like? Being a better partner, being a better friend, being more empathetic, maybe being better at my particular field or craft, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being knocking it out of the park, where would I say that I am with my key relationships? Same thing with your job, your career, your finances, and recreation. So go ahead and hit pause and give yourself a score of 1 to 10 on each of those circles. Now that you've rated yourself in those areas, I want you to look at the 3 areas that you scored yourself the least. And you can go ahead and circle them, you can highlight them, you can just add them in a different column, whatever is important to you. What you'll probably notice about those 3 is that they're the 3 that you give the least amount of energy to at this particular moment in time, right? I've been focused so much on my business that I've been neglecting my key relationships. That's why I see it that way. Or maybe we've had a lot of things, emergencies or a dip in business, and I haven't really been looking at setting a budget. We've been doing things frivolously, not really where we wanted to be financially. So I'm seeing that I scored myself lower financially. The great thing about doing this exercise is that you can do this exercise on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, and you'll notice that you score yourself differently every single time because life is ever moving, ever changing, and you're typically going to give your energy to more areas of your life than others in any given period. So the idea is that we want to check in with these 7 circles quite often so that we can know, are we in alignment with what we said were those things that were purposeful for us in a life of intention? Now, in your workbook, you'll see that there are some goals that you can set around each of these 7 areas. So the idea of setting a 2023 goal for your spiritual health. Well, what does that look like? Well, maybe that is a morning routine. Maybe that's meditating. Maybe that's yoga, whatever it might be for you. Maybe it's reading your Bible every single morning. Setting a goal for your spiritual self in 2023, you want to be able to do. Same thing with your physical health. Same thing with your personal growth. Same thing with recreation, your spouse, partner, significant other. So I'd like you to go through this process and identify goals, just one goal, such that by doing it makes everything else easier or unnecessary in that particular area of your life. So go ahead and hit pause, and you're going to answer each of those 7 circles based on what a life of intention looks like in each of those areas. Now, going through this exercise, this might have been enlightening for you. You might have noticed that for your physical health, you might have put something down like, I want to lose 20 pounds. All right, well, that's a results-oriented goal, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But as we'll talk about next week about the difference between being process-oriented versus being results-oriented, maybe understanding what a healthy lifestyle looks like. So I want to be active 5 days a week for at least 30 minutes. That would be a process-oriented goal towards physical health. Maybe I say that I want to be active 5 days a week, and that I also want to make sure that I am hitting a caloric goal or I'm tracking my food and my calories on a daily basis for 6 out of the 7 days a week, right? Again, I am being process oriented. I'm focused on the activities that are going to get me the results, and understanding that weight loss is going to be a byproduct of that process. For me, for my spouse, partner, significant other, what is the one thing such that by doing makes everything else easier and unnecessary was making sure that we had date night every single week and being very intentional about making sure that that happens every single week. For us, it was Thursdays. We have to change our schedule a little bit because of things going on with family in terms of what that day looks like. But for us, just saying Thursdays were date night allowed us to be intentional of picking a place, getting out of the house, catching up, talking about goals, talking about future trips, talking about things, just connecting on a personal level without talking about obligations or talking about work, so that we were able to connect on a high level, right? So this concept of you being able to go through and identify these goals is going to be really interesting to look at some of the things. You know, as we mentioned, we're going to talk about setting unit goals and GCI goals based on what funding a life by design looks like. But I also want to ask you, as I did last week, to think in these 7 circles and realize that if my week included me being intentional in these 7 circles of my life, that my week included me time blocking the things that are a priority for me, including working out, spending time with my spouse, vacations, being very intentional with my work week, how different would a year like that look like than what I've had in the past? You know, in closing, one of my favorite quotes from Zig Ziglar is this idea of, do you want to be a wandering generality or a meaningful specific? And a wandering generality is most people that move through life, you know, they kind of ping pong from one thing to the next. They react to life, and kind of whatever comes their way is what they do. But being a meaningful person, right? That idea of being a meaningful specific is that I'm intentional about the time that I wake up and the food that I eat and the people that I spend my time with and the relationships that I develop and where I spend my money and where I spend my energy. You know, I'm able to make sure that I'm crafting a life, and that a life of intention, or what is sometimes referred to as a life by design, is one that I have been very purposeful and intentional about where I'm putting my time, my energy, and my money. Now, if any of that feels exhausting, don't worry, it's not going to happen all the time. But even asking yourself, what would it look like if 60% of my year, or 60% of my week, or 60% of my day was done with intention and purpose? How different would my world look like in a year from now? I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope you're able to get through a lot of the exercises and setting some intentions, looking at the 7 circles. If you've not completely finished your personal expenses, go back and look at your personal expenses. Begin to build a plan for yourself on how you're going to eliminate some of the debt and liability that you have. Identify what that financial independence and financial freedom number looks like for you, and how we can set a goal towards getting there and by when. There's a lot to unpack with this week, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, whether it's through the live Q&A during our one-on-one coaching periods or during the focus group. I want to make sure that we don't skip over any of these things, that we're really purposeful in the goals that you're setting, so that 2023 is led with purpose and intention. Until next time, I'll see you soon.